everyone. How's everybody doing? I hope you're all having a good day today. Um, for this week's chapter, I'm actually going to be using chapter 9, the slides that actually the publisher provides. I'm kind of taking a look to see which ones work for me, work for you. Um, After you read this, if you want to shoot me a quick email and just let me know what your thoughts are, you're more than welcome to. But nonetheless, I'm going to use the publisher slides this week and see how that goes. All right. So let's start off. Chapter 9 is called the structuring and ordering persuasive messages. And really, the idea is how do you put it together in what order? If you remember when you talked about persuasive speeches, if you took speech class or communication class, they call it different names. Um, the idea is that you put in order the sequence, right? You express the problem, here's the solution, right? You don't do solution first, you do the problem solution. You do different things, you arrange it in different ways. And so the idea is, how do you structure the message? How do you put it together? And there's a couple components that the chapter talks about. So let's start off with the way it's sort of um, broken down. All right. So Cicero, back in Greek, in early Greece, they kind of define rhetoric, right? And the first one was Desposito, which was the effective or orderly arrangement of ideas, right? How do you arrange the ideas so that it makes sense, right? Elocution, which is fluency, command of the language. How well are you able to fluently communicate with your audience? Um, do you have the invention and discovery of arguments, which was inventio? Um, and then you have memoria, which is the memory and mnemonic devices, right? This is when we start talking about sort of the different jingles that people remember, or the things that people remember out of the entire message, right? And then you have pronunciado, which is the delivery factor, such as pitch, rate, voice quality, right? This is when you start getting into sort of the excitement, the energy of of rhetoric. So it moves on here to implicit versus explicit conclusions, right? Is it better to spell out things out for the listener, or is it better to the listener to figure things out for him or herself, right? When you're talking about implicit, think of it as you imply something. You don't say it directly, but you imply it, right? Or explicit, you're being very direct, right? When you spell things out, um, uh, for the listener, the source may be perceived as more candid, more forthright, right? And there is less risk that the listener will reach the wrong conclusion. If I tell you make a left, you're going to make a left, right? And whereas, is it better to let the listener figure things out for him or herself? The source may seem less patronizing in that situation, and there's also less risk of psychological reactance. For example, the perception that the listener's choice is being restricted. In other words, when you imply something and you kind of lead the audience then sort of learns it, and it's almost kind of like they learn it from themselves, which in some cases may make it seem like, oh yeah, I got it, yeah, that makes sense, as opposed to me telling you what it is and you're like, okay, I'll do it, but I'm doing it because I trust you. And so you didn't arrive to that conclusion. So the audience is doing the same thing, but either they arrive by themselves, or is it you push them there? There's two ways of doing it, and really not that one is better than the other, but you got to figure it out which one is better based on the situation. So implicit versus explicit conclusions. For involved listeners, implicit conclusions are generally preferred. For knowledgeable receivers, implicit conclusions are also preferred. So these are people who are really paying attention, really knowledgeable on the subject. Sometimes implicit can lead them to it, and then they can figure it out for themselves. And they're able to because they're knowledgeable in the subject, right? They tend to be more participatory. The self-generate conclusions are more palatable. In other words, they reach their own conclusions, which means they can then accept those conclusions. Their involved listeners can draw their own conclusion. There's less risk of psychological reactance. In other words, they react a little bit more acceptable to the idea. And then the message is more acceptable to the hostile audience. when you have a hostile audience, these are people who are reluctant or don't agree with you. And so if they're able to reach that conclusion on their own, they're probably more likely to accept it because they got there on their own versus being told to get there. Implicit versus explicit conclusions. Explicit conclusions are better when the message is not personally relevant to the listener. In other words, if I don't care, I'm not going to pay attention. Therefore, you have to give me explicit instructions so that I could, do exactly what you want me to do. The listeners aren't knowledgeable about the issue, and the message is complex or could be easily misconstrued. If it's too complex of an idea, do this, do that, do this, do that. Um, just tell me, right? I'm trying to figure it out. I trust you. Just tell me what it is you want me to do, and I'll get it done, right? And so sometimes explicit conclusions are better for those people who are less knowledgeable. Then you have what's called gain framed versus loss framed messages. Oh, and by the way, we are on page, looks like 213. Is it 213? Yeah, 213 it looks like. So let me turn off my messages here. Sorry about that. All right. So is it better to emphasize potential gains? Gain frame messages emphasize the positive results. You could get rich on the investment opportunity, right? This is what you could do. Ooh, it's exciting. You should do this because this is what you can get. Or is it better to emphasize the potential losses? Loss frame messages emphasize the negative, right? You could lose everything that you've saved. You shouldn't do it because yeah, you'll lose everything versus the gain. It's like, oh, you should do it because you'll be better, right? And so it really is on if you're trying to get someone not to do something, you might be better off telling them what they could lose if they do it because there's a potential for loss and that fear may give people away. Or if you want to push someone towards doing something, you may actually want to say, oh yeah, if you do it, you can do this or you'll be able to do that or you'll get this or you'll get that, right? In general, loss frame messages are more effective. People are generally risk averse. They are more worried about losing what they already have, right? A bird in the hand is worth in two in the bush. And some of you have sort of heard that saying where you're better off with what you already have versus trying to get something which you may and may not get, right? Um, Present-minded people respond better to loss-frame messages. In other words, those who are sort of in the present like to say the things that like the way the things they are. That they don't want to lose anything. And then future-minded people equally receptive to gain or loss-frame messages. So if you're worried about the future, chances are you're more inclined to take a risk, um, or you may take a loss. It's sort of even on that one. You have to kind of read your audience. In a controlled study, 75% of respondents chose option A, gain frame. So they always wanted to see sort of um, sort of the positive thing. 58% of respondents chose B, which is loss frame. The probability is the same for both scenarios. So why do more people choose A? When designing a persuasive message, just tell your audience that it stands to lose by non-compliance. Really, the idea here is as you start sort of reading all these different messages, is that in order to convince a certain amount of audience, you can either instill fear in them for what they might lose, or instill motivation on what they might gain. Right? It's really one or the other. And we've seen sort of politicians, we've seen certain ads, we've seen certain commercials that if you take this you'll be here, right? This is sort of like if you look at the nutritional commercials that sort of say that if you take this medicine, right, you too can live a wonderful life, right? This is like the pharmaceutical commercials where they show someone walking on the beach, and if you suffer from this by taking this, you'll have that, right? That's gain. You gain that part of life, right? Where in other aspects they may use fear where they say if you don't take this message in, you could get this, right? You could lose this. There was a commercial, I think it was that for HPV or something like that, where a certain vaccine is available for kids, I think at age 14 or something. And by taking that vaccine, it reduces the risk of getting cancer as an adult. And it's one of those things that don't say the loss is like, oh yeah, you need to take it because if you don't, oh man, this could happen. You could lose your son, you could lose your daughter, and it's that fear of what you might lose, right? So it's interesting how they use both sort of scenarios depending on what it is they're trying to sell. The role of receiver involvement in ELM, and if you remember ELM, let's see what page we're on now. All right, so we're and ELM. If you remember, in another chapter, it talked about the where was it at? The elaboration likelihood model. It was discussed in chapter 2. According to ELM, there are two routes to persuasion: peripheral route and central route. Right, sort of the outside that people can sort of take it and sort of lead themselves, or the central route, which is very similar to being direct versus what imply. Right, so you sort of see the parallels there. So the role of receiver involvement in ELM is for receivers with low involvement. It is the quantity of arguments that counts. So the more arguments you have for something with those people who are not really involved in the situation, the more arguments they have, the more likely you are to convince me. For receivers with high involvement, it's not about how many arguments you have, it's about the quality of those arguments. You can have just two or three and you'll convince me to do something because they make sense, because I'm aware, as long as those arguments make sense. They're factual in their data. They do exactly they say, and they are exactly what they say they are, versus all these different examples. If I'm not involved and I'm not knowledgeable in the subject, you're going to give me all these different examples because I don't know. And so for me to get it, you have to provide more and more arguments so that it makes sense in my head. So again, low involvement, more arguments. High involvement, quality arguments. Now, evidence and proof. Now, evidence uses almost always facilitates persuasion. Evidence can increase speaker credibility. We've all seen that from our speech classes. High quality evidence may increase central processing, and there's ceiling effect for high credible sources who use evidence. And you have the ceiling effect, which means that you reach a limit. You can only put so many sources in there and so much evidence before you hit. At some point, you just have to let the audience make a decision. And evidence is most effective when receivers have high involvement. Evidence can function as a peripheral cue. A prosecutor presents a mountain of evidence, right? So when you have high involvement, evidence is really effective, right? And here, when it talks about the prosecutor has a mountain of evidence, it means that they may not have, like for example, if a lawyer is accusing someone of committing a crime, and unless they have a picture or video showing them doing it, they have to bring in all this outside evidence to paint the picture because they don't have that video, they don't have that picture, right? So what happens is that you see this and you see that, you see this and you see that, and when you put it all together, it leads you to believe that, yeah, that person did it. Why? Because it has a mountain of evidence. You have a lot of evidence, and that evidence makes sense, right? So when you look at it from the perspective of a prosecutor who's trying to convict someone of trying to do something, and he doesn't have or she doesn't have a video or a picture showing exactly that they did it, they have to come up with outside evidence to prove that they did. You have anecdotal versus statistical proof. By nature, people are drawn to stories. Let me tell you about an experience I had, right? But anecdotal evidence is subject to the hasty generalization fallacy. In other words, you arrive to a conclusion very fast, right? Not taking the time to really take all the information in. And people often distrust statistics because you can prove anything with statistics, yet quantifiable evidence is more testable and more generalizable. In other words, you can rely on it a lot more. And so the idea here is that, yeah, statistics can show a lot of things. I remember there was a statistic that showed that a certain politician was favored by 64%. And everybody's like, wow, that's a great statistic showing that 64% of the people think they're doing a good job. And you kind of have to step back and say, well, 36% think you're not. Am I the only one that's worried about that 36% because I'm not paying attention to it? What's going on here? And so again, data can be manipulated in some fashion sometimes to favor you, even though sometimes it really doesn't. So you have to be careful about that as well. Again, anecdotal versus statistical evidence. However, a meta-analysis found a slight advantage for statistical evidence. More people are likely to believe numbers. Different types of statistical proof have an additive effect. In other words, they add when you have more stats that sort of prove the same point, it kind of leads you to believe that it's likely true. However, in laboratory studies, subjects are paying close attention, high involvement, right? So you have to really pay attention to the stats. If you are highly involved in a case, let's say you're a juror, you're going to pay really close attention to the statistical data that's being put upon you, and so you're highly involved. When a receiver pays close attention, statistics tend to be more effective. And when the receivers do not pay close attention, narratives tend to be more effective. So when you have a juror, for example, who isn't paying attention to the statistics or is not really knowledgeable or can't really conceptualize what those numbers actually mean and what they represent, a lot of times they're swayed not by the numbers, but by the story, right? As a persuader, you should use both. Begin with a narrative, telling a story, and explain and add the statistics to show the example is not atypical. So what happens is that it's not just about giving the numbers, it's about telling the story and then having the numbers to support your story, have the story make sense. Then you got repetition and the mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect is repeated exposure to a stimulus increases liking for the stimulus. Ideas, brands, people tend to grow on us. What's familiar is comfortable and reassuring. And really, what you want to think about is um, what the more often you see something, the more likely you are to accept it, the more likely you are to remember it, the more likely you are to accept it, right? And it's interesting right now, especially during political season, all you see are these commercials for all the propositions that are being put out there. This and that, vote yes on this, vote yet and that, and they're just repetitive and repetitive and repetitive. And what happens is that politicians and governments and agencies, they put all this money into these ads right before voting season because they want to push that agenda on you. You want to push, and the more it's repeated, the more you'll see it, the more it's likely you're going to vote their way. Why? Not because you're ill-informed, but just because it's repetitive. You remember, no on, Proposition 55 or whatever it is, right? The more likely you are to hear the message, no on 55, no on 55, no on 55, no on 55, you're going to be like, well, I guess I'm voting no on 55 then, right? So Americans who are exposed to Chinese characters prefer the ones they saw more frequently. This was sort of an interesting thing: is the more often you see something, the more often you're going to accept it. Um, and then the mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect is stronger for topics and issues that are personally relevant. So when you really think about something, you're more likely to accept it because if you already like it, if you're already into it, you're going to accept it a little bit more. Repetition can increase awareness and learning retention. And the one thing you have to be careful about though is the wear out. It can occur with overexposure. And this is funny because do you ever have like a song that's a really good song? You like it, it's fun, it's nice, it's got a nice beat, but it's played on the radio so many times that after a while you're like, oh, okay, I heard it. All right, it's a good song. And then after a while you're like, you're just changing the channel on the radio because you're just like, I've already heard this. Play something else, right? So again, you have to be careful. Even though something's good, you can wear it out if it's repeated way too many times. The order effects. You've got so the order of putting things in order. Anticlimax is giving your best arguments first. That means that you got to put this out there, and it's got to make sense. It's really got to grab your attention. And you know what's interesting? I had an uncle who does real estate, and he says that a lot of times what he does is he will show the best house first, right? So he's got a client that he's showing houses to. And he says, if there's a house that I think is perfect for them, I'll show them the house that I think is perfect. It's nice, it's this, it's that. It's maybe the top of their price range, but it's there. And then I show them two other houses that are like, maybe not as good, right? The first house has the pool, it has the 2 stories, it has the extra bedroom or office, it's nice. Yeah, it's pushing the boundary a little bit on their limit, but it's nice, right? And then the other two houses are like single story, no pool. You know, all of a sudden, those second and third house, it doesn't compare to the first house. And though therefore the clients are going to be like, oh no, I remember the first house. And they're likely to what? Be persuaded to purchase that one or to make an offer on that. You got the pyramidal order, which is placing your best arguments in the middle, right? And really, it's the idea that you show one, if you go back to the example of the house, you show one that's okay. You show a great one that you can say, ah, look at how much this one is better than. And then you show one that's like, right? And so the idea is that you can make the first two comparisons and make note that the second option is great, but then when you get to the third option, it's not as good as the second. So, you're going to go with that. And then obviously you have the climax order, which is saving your best arguments for the end, which is saving the best for last, right? And if you go back to the real estate argument, it's you show a house that's okay, your second house that's okay, and then the third house, oh my God, it is phenomenal. People are going to love it. It's the one with the pool, the whole shebang, and that's how they're persuaded. I think personally, I like the anticlimax for it, especially with the idea of buying a house. But reality is, you have to choose the one that's best for you. And research shows that it is better to place your strongest arguments first or last. The worst approach is to put your best arguments in the middle. And the reason for that is people are more likely to remember what they saw last, or if it's the first thing, it's the shock factor, right? It's like, wow, right? The first thing that comes out. So first or last are usually the best ones, and the middle one is usually like you have primacy versus recency. People are better at remembering things that are earlier or later in a sequence rather than in the middle. And really, what it says there, going back to the last slide, it's like, are you going to remember either the first thing you heard or the last thing you heard, right? And again, you're going to do it for different reasons. The last thing you heard is because it's the last thing you heard. You always tend to remember the last thing. The recency, it's because it's the first thing. It pops out. Ooh, what is that? And so again, it just sort of depends, right? And the graph here shows how people sort of remember the first thing versus the last thing a lot more. And you notice in the middle, it's at the bottom of the graph. Continuing on with primacy versus recency, when there are opposing sides, is it better to speak first or last? The primacy effect, it is better to speak first if the speeches are back to back. Recency effect is that it's better to speak last if the speeches are separated in time. So what it's saying here is that if you have two speakers, it's better to be the last speaker. Especially if it's like boom boom. If it's the recency effect, if there's going to be space, so let's say there's a debate, right? And the debate's happening at the same time. So first you're going to say something, and as soon as you're done, this person's going to say something. That in that situation, you want to be the first person, sorry, you want to be the first person because that person grabs the attention, and the second person needs to match that attention, right? Which is really hard because you're first. But when there's time, so let's just say that you're going to give your speech today, and the second person is going to give their speech, let's say tomorrow or the next day or the day after that. Then you want to be the last person because by the time that it gets to you as the last speaker, time has already passed. And the likelihood of them remembering everything that that person said is not going to be very good, but they're going to remember everything you said because you're the last person who spoke. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind. Primacy versus recency effects. Here you have a graph here that I think does a really good job. Primacy effect most likely, recency effect most likely, and neither primacy nor recency effect. I'll let you take the time to view this, and it kind of explains what we've discussed. Primacy versus recency again. Bland topics. A recency effect is more likely with uninvolving, non-controversial material. So what it's saying there is that if it's something that's just not exciting, something that just is kind of bland, it's something that's not involving, you want to use the recency effect, right? Those are things that people are going to remember last, not because they're great products, but it's the last thing they remember. Intriguing topics, usually the primacy effect is more likely because it's more interesting. It captures your attention from the get-go. Product comparisons. Recency effect is effect for equally desirable music. Primacy effect for equally undesirable music. So in that situation there, whether it's desirable or undesirable, primacy is usually it looks to be pretty good. Experiential products like music produce a recency effect. It's all about the fashion and the fad. When it talks about experiential products, think of fast fashion, right? Think of like products. What's the latest fashion trend? And something you bought that right now is probably not going to be in fashion 6 months from now. So therefore, you're always keeping up with the latest fashion, right? And non-experiential products like scissors, light bulbs, it's the primacy effect. If you need it, go get it, do it now. It's about what comes first. The next thing you have is inoculation. Let me find it in the book here. All right. So, and I'm on page 221. So, inoculation theory is based on a disease metaphor, which is a small dose of opposing opposition can increase resistance to subsequent persuasion. Inoculation is more effective than a supportive bolstering strategy. And what that says here, and this is what I mean by disease. Think of the flu shot, right? So, in order to, what the flu shot is, it's a very weak version of the latest flu. And so, by giving you that vaccine, your body builds a resistance to that little small sort of weak flu so that it has an immunity to that bigger, stronger flu when it tries to enter your body. That's what this is. It really is the idea that by giving you a little bit of information and a little bit of truisms, cultural truisms, these are beliefs that we take for granted. The more likely you are to to sort of build a recognition to what they're trying to inoculate you for. So inoculation is less effective on controversial topics. So if it's something that's controversial, for example, inoculation, which is just a little bit, doesn't help that much, right? Because we want to see the opposing side. Whereas if it's something that are just cultural beliefs that are sort of all the way through, things that you teach your kids, things that your parents taught you, saving money, being on time, you know, they hound you, right? Think about timeliness, right? Think about the importance of being on time. And we were all late at some point, right? Especially as kids, teenagers, we always took our time to get out of bed. We always took our time to be somewhere. And our parents were always what? Gotta be on time. Hurry up. Come on, let's go. We're running late, right? You have to be on time. It's important. And it's something that's true because once you get to be an adult and once you start having adult meetings at your job, at your career, at the company you work for, then you're going to realize that what? Oh man, timeliness is important. I do have to be on time, right? So getting out of bed early, I mean late when you're a kid, it really has little consequences. So therefore what? They can feed you all those little things about being on time. And eventually, hopefully, you build it up to where you can say, all right, fine, I'll be on time. And then as you get it to be an adult, you're like, man, I'm glad I built up that habit of being on time. Now, how inoculation works, we kind of talked about this. Threat is a motivational trigger. What do your parents tell you? We don't when you're late. I'm going to take away your car keys. I'm going to take away your phone. This or that, right? So a threat is always there. It increases the receiver's perceived vulnerability. The listener then bolsters his or her defenses. Inoculation protects beyond the original arguments used, and inoculation increases immunity to new novel arguments as well. So what happens is that if they're trying to get you to be on time and I'm going to take away your phone, you said, all right, fine, fine. And you start changing your habits, right? You're inoculating yourself to being on time. Now, when something else comes up that that they want you to learn, you're going to be a little bit more accepting of that, right? One-sided versus two-sided messages. So two-sided messages are almost always more persuasive, right? A refutational approach is required. The persuader must directly refute, not merely acknowledge opposing arguments. In other words, what this is saying is that if I am going to make an argument towards you, I have to acknowledge that there's somebody else arguing on the other side. I can't just ignore it. One, if that argument appears out of nowhere from somebody else, then the person who got your message was like, well, why didn't he tell me about it? Right? You never told me this other side of it. So what happens is that when the other person argues against you, they're going to be able to get that person's attention because that other person that you try to persuade, you never inoculated them. You never prepared them to receive the other side, the counter argument. Now, there are some exceptions for the receivers. A, when they already agree, you don't have to show the opposing side because they already agree with you to begin with. They can be easily confused. So sometimes it's like, okay, look, just let me give you the information that you need. They're uneducated or unintelligent. Sometimes they may have to do with the lack of education or they're just not old enough to understand. And they will not be exposed to the opposing side at a later time. So if that person is never going to see the counter argument, then what's the point of even bringing it up, right? Pick and choose the correct spots. There's a hierarchy of effectiveness for one-sided versus two-sided messages. The persuasion hierarchy, which is from most to least persuasive. Two-sided is refutational messages, which are 20% more effective overall than one-sided messages. One-sided messages are 20% more effective than two-sided non-refutational messages. Let's understand what refutational messages are. When we're talking about refutational messages, it means someone can refute that. It means someone can argue against that. Okay? And then two-sided non-refutational messages are least effective at all. Right? So why are you gonna argue against yourself when really nobody's gonna argue against you? It's non-refutable, right? Okay. And then forewarning. Forewarning is increases resistance to influence attempts. Receivers adopt a less receptive state of mind, and receivers may prepare defenses and rehearse counter arguments. Forewarning is effective. Forewarning's effectiveness depends upon the motivation and ability to disagree. In other words, forewarning means like, hey, just to let you know, somebody else may do this, or you may see this in the future, right? You're giving them a warning about the future of what may come up. And by doing that, you're actually preparing them to fight against that. Forewarning versus inoculation. Forewarning warns a listener of an impending attack, which is the warning of a persuasive intent. Forewarning may or may not mention the topic area that it will be attacked. And inoculation not mentions the topic area. It includes a weakened dose of the actual opposing argument. And so when you're talking about forewarning, it's really the idea, it's about giving a forewarning about what may happen. Not entirely about what specifically may happen because you're not really sure, right? It may or may not mention the topic area that will be attacked. In other words, something may happen, I'm just not sure what it is, so be careful, right? And so you have to kind of understand that forewarning could also be used as a tool as you convince someone to maintain sort of that defense in case someone tries to convince them otherwise. And then we get to the strength model of self-control. Mental fatigue reduces one's willpower to resist persuasion. Mental fatigue is when your brain is just done. You're just tired. You're like, fine. You know, at some point when you're just weak-minded, and I mean weak-minded, not like weak and you can't fight back. It means you're just tired. You're just like your mind is weak, your brain is fried, right? At some, you're like, all right, fine. Think of a situation like as parents. I can, think of situations where my son or my daughter wanted something, and they literally just wore me down, right? Just, Dad, can I get this? Dad, can I get that? Dad, when am I gonna get this? Dad, when am I get that? You know, you're like, no, no, no. And after a while, you're like, fine, right? It just wore you down. You just became like, fine, let me get rid of it because I just didn't want to resist anymore. I just wanted to get rid of it and just, all right, fine, here you go. Which isn't necessarily always good. Forewarning conserves mental resources. And what forewarning does is that it says, hey, just so you know, you're going to say no to your kid. And you're going to say, no, you can't have that toy. But you know what? This is what they're going to do. They're going to just hound you. They're going to prepare for you. They're going to remind you. Be ready for that, right? And by mentally preparing yourself for when that happens, you're more likely to be able to resist. Okay? All right, so let's move on here. And then psychological reactance. Forewarning may explicit psychological reactance. Its perceived threats to one's freedom increases resistance. That means that when I fear that someone's going to take away my freedom in some aspect, I'm going to resist. I'm going to fight, right? A warning of persuasive intent galvanizes a person to resist the influence attempt. There was a situation, I think it was in New York a couple of years ago, where they tried to pass a law that that made like 32-ounce sodas at 7-Eleven or something like that illegal. Like you couldn't buy, they couldn't sell these giant gallons of soda that you could just go to 7-Eleven and just fill up, right? They limited it to like, I don't know, 12 ounces, 10 ounces, but there was these giant jugs. And the reasoning behind it was that kids were just buying these sodas at great amounts and they was having an obesity problem. And so Coca-Cola and other beverages sort of launched a campaign basically saying, hey, the government, the state of New York is trying to limit what you can buy. If they can do this, what else can they do? And people start being like, no, 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 no. I'm not, you can't tell me whether or not I'm going to buy that soda. I don't want to buy the soda, but it's because I don't want to do it, not because you're telling me not to do it, right? So again, that's a reactance. That's a psychological reactance. Okay. So anyways, so that's the end of the chapter. It's a pretty interesting chapter. You'll notice that the slides here are a lot more slides than my typical slides. So I'm not really sure whether or not I'm going to keep on doing with the ones that I get from the publisher or create my own. But for this week, we're going to use this one. All right. So if you have any questions, you're always welcome to email me. Please send me a quick email. Say hello. Tell me what your thoughts are. And if you want to have a Zoom meeting, we can do that as well. All right. Thanks, everybody. Take care.